already sitting in the carriage, the main character nervously tried to catch her breath. The Duke, however, thought to himself that he didn't care about Maris. His main concern was saving the girl. He turned to her and asked if she was okay, to which she replied, still out of breath, that she wasn't. Asher, turning away to look out the window, silently mused that Lariette would surely end their relationship now, having seen how cruel he could be. Yet, since they were bound by a contract, he reasoned that nothing else should matter to him. But things didn't turn out as he expected. Smiling, the main character praised the Duke, saying what he did was impressive, and adding that he was even cooler than the character in the play. Hearing this, Asher opened his mouth in surprise. After that, they drove in silence. Lariette still believed it was wrong to resort to violence so often, but the girl admitted that in this case, it had been self-defense. The next day, the same priest came to see Lariette, because, after attending the show, she had caught a cold again. Concerned, the priest asked if she was feeling better, urging her to be more careful. Lariette hadn't expected to get sick so quickly and decided to inquire if it was possible to cure an incurable disease with divine power. She seemed excited yet nervous as she asked. Smiling sweetly, Doha explained that an incurable disease is one that can't be treated by either magic or divine power. If there is any possibility of treatment, then it's no longer considered incurable. This answer left Lariette feeling upset, realizing that everything would still die anyway. But then, smiling wider, Doha added that it might be possible to cure such a disease with divine power equal to that of His Holiness the Pope. What Lariette didn't know was that Doha himself held such power. Using his abilities, the priest saw that the main character's mana chain was curved, a rare case caused by an excess of unbalanced and uncontrolled mana. From what he could tell, Lariette wouldn't die, but would suffer from bone pain her entire life. Healing would be difficult, but not impossible. Recognizing Lariette as a very talented wizard, Doha didn't mind investing in her recovery. He offered to help, saying he would treat her periodically. Upon hearing this, Lariette exclaimed joyfully and expressed her deep gratitude. Suddenly, Doha asked for her forgiveness and, without warning, pulled Lariette into his arms. Before she could even react, she found herself tightly embraced. Doha leaned in closer, apparently placing a healing kiss on her lips. A soft light illuminated the room as he gently held her head, using magic to heal her from the inside. Afterward, he pulled away, stating that the treatment was over for the day. Lariette blushed deeply, like a ripe tomato. Doha added that the procedure would need to be repeated several times. Lariette, still flustered, managed a quiet, "Thank you." Slowly, the priest asked if she could help him in return as a sign of gratitude. Slowly extending his hand, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a large wound. Seeing it, Lariette gasped in surprise. She gently touched it and asked how he had suffered such an injury. Doha explained that it had happened recently. As he spoke, the room was again bathed in bright light, and the wound instantly healed. Watching this, Doha thought his theories had been confirmed. Lariette, exhausted, collapsed onto the bed, noting that the process had drained too much of her mana. Doha thanked her, acknowledging that it wasn't surprising she had spent so much energy on him, as he was a high priest. He then pulled out a precious stone and handed it to Lariette, saying it was payment for her help. She was puzzled by where he had gotten such a valuable item. Doha, of course, lied and said he had simply picked it up. Lariette didn't expect such a grand reward for just one treatment, so she told him she would treat him as a regular client going forward. Added with a playful tone, she added that there was no other sorceress he could visit except her. The statement made Doha laugh. After that, his expression shifted slightly, becoming more cunning, as if this was what he had been waiting for all along. Doha willingly agreed with the heroine, now determined not to let her go or allow her to escape. The next day, as Lariette walked through the corridors, she encountered the butler. He wished her a good morning and asked if she was looking for the Duke. She confirmed this and asked if he knew where Asher was. The butler explained that the Duke had returned late and was now sleeping, which initially upset Lariette, but then he brightened her mood by suggesting she be the one to wake him. Surprised, she asked if she was really allowed to do that. The butler, smiling joyfully, assured her that it was perfectly fine, secretly thinking how happy he'd be if she not only woke the Duke, but also eventually married him. He gave her directions to Asher's bedroom, and, though nervous, Lariette made her way there, feeling a bit awkward since she had never been in his private quarters before. When she reached the bedroom, she carefully opened the door and was taken aback by how large the room was. Approaching the Duke's bed, she softly wished him good morning. Asher reluctantly lifted his head from the pillow, recognizing the familiar voice, but not fully awake yet. After blinking a few times to focus, he realized it was Lariette standing above him. Squinting, he asked why she was there, still groggy from sleep. Lariette, sitting on the edge of the bed, explained that it would be best to conduct the cleansing ritual in the bedroom and suggested they finish it quickly. Asher, still not fully understanding, asked what she meant. Smiling, Lariette explained that starting from that day, she would be cleansing his upper body, and the curse would only be lifted if she touched his bare skin. Asher was taken aback by this and hesitated. The heroine, approaching him, suggested that he undress, to which he nervously backed away. Embarrassed, he stammered that there was no need for her to do it and quickly began unbuttoning his shirt. Once his shirt was off, he looked away, feeling incredibly awkward. His body was wrapped in bandages, and Lariette gazed at him with wide eyes. Looking up, Asher asked if he should remove the bandages too. Lariette, blushing, replied that the cleansing required contact with bare skin. At this, Asher turned red like a tomato, but, after a moment of hesitation, removed the bandages. Lariette, upon seeing his scarred but enchanted body, was shocked. Asher, in turn, quickly averted his eyes, feeling even more uncomfortable. Lariette was stunned by the sight, realizing that the curse was far more powerful than she had anticipated. Gently placing her hand on his chest, she began explaining that the curse was too great to be lifted in one session, but she promised to do her best. Asher, nervously covering his mouth with his hand, avoided her gaze, feeling more embarrassed by the second as she got closer to him. Suddenly, Lariette stopped, realizing that she had exhausted too much mana. Weakened, she collapsed onto Asher's chest, alarming him. He called out her name, confused because everything had seemed to be going well up until that moment. With her eyes closed, Lariette explained weakly that her mana had been drained because she had healed the Reaper the previous day. Asher, both embarrassed and bewildered, listened as she casually recounted how she had befriended the Reaper and offered to help him from time to time, as long as it didn't interfere with the curse purification. Still flustered, Asher, struggling to understand, asked if she treated the Reaper the same way she was treating him. Lariette, confused by the question, didn't know what he was referring to. Realizing his thoughts had wandered, Asher cleared his throat and mentioned that he always thought priests were usually women. He then told her to do as she wished. Suddenly, Lariette opened her eyes for a brief moment and, with an unexpected question, asked when he would finally fall in love with her. After that, Lariette collapsed into Asher's lap from exhaustion. The man didn't even have time to respond to her question before his expression darkened. He clenched his fist angrily, seemingly blaming himself for her weakened state. Later, Asher began avoiding her for reasons unknown, while Lariette searched the entire estate for him without success. One day, as she sat at a table drinking tea, she shared her frustrations with Lodin, confiding that the Duke continued to avoid her. She couldn't understand if she had put too much pressure on him, which embarrassed her. Lodin, who had become her close friend while they were searching for Escher, listened attentively. Lariette couldn't help but notice that Doris seemed surprisingly good at giving love advice, and from the way he carried himself, she was sure he had been with many women. Doha caught her gaze and smiled knowingly. Then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, he suggested a bold idea. Make Asher jealous. Slowly, he reached out and twirled a strand of Larette's hair around his finger, gazing at her seductively. He told her that no man could resist the sight of the woman he loves with another. Lariette, a bit flustered, replied that she didn't have a suitable partner, thinking back to her lack of experience with boyfriends or male friends due to her complicated past with her ex-fiance. Her innocence amused Doha, who suddenly placed his hand on the back of her head and pulled her closer, their faces just millimeters apart. Looking into her eyes, he softly reminded her that he was also a man, subtly hinting at himself as a candidate. Holding her close, Doha managed to talk to her while treating her wounds at the same time. Lariette was surprised by his boldness, and the idea of making Asher jealous didn't seem so bad after all. She even allowed herself to imagine Asher begging her not to leave him, pleading with her as he feared going mad without her. The thought made her blush, though she quickly pushed it aside, realizing it would probably hurt Asher in the long run. Lariette thanked Doha for his help, telling him that she would figure out her own way to handle the situation. She was confident that she could win over the Duke without resorting to manipulation, mentally urging Asher to wait for her. Late that night, as Asher quietly returned from his business and tried to slip into the estate unnoticed, a voice called out to him. It was Lariette, sitting on the steps. Her expression stern, almost like a mother who had been waiting up for her child to reprimand them. Startled, Asher froze, surprised and nervous to see her there. He asked why she wasn't asleep. Lariette, a bit flustered herself, replied that she had been waiting for him. She complained that it had been hard to get a glimpse of him recently, as his busy schedule seemed to keep him away. Rising from the steps, she approached him, raising her head to meet his eyes. It was clear to her that it was time to confront him directly. She reminded him of their agreement to take walks twice a week, and asked if he had forgotten. Asher wasn't sure if the ache he felt was from the stress in his stomach or a deeper pain in his heart, but one thing was certain. Whenever he stood in front of Lariette, he felt strange. It was precisely this strange, unfamiliar feeling that had driven him to avoid her in recent days. Not wanting to prolong the discomfort, Asher quickly invited her to take a walk in the garden tomorrow, then diverted his eyes to avoid her gaze. Lariette began to realize that she was the only one truly holding on to their relationship. As long as she continued cleansing him, Asher would be fine, but she also needed to consider her own well-being. After all, her time was running out, and she didn't want to face death by submitting and giving up like she had in the past. Forcing a smile, she suggested that Asher must have been very busy lately, which explained why he came home so late. She then added that he didn't need to feel obligated to walk with her or share meals together if it was too much for him. Lariette smiled faintly, addressing him as Duke, and remarked that he was busy, implying she was only distracting him with everything. How can anyone say they are Duke for the first time when she had always used his name? Asher's eyes widened in shock. Something had clearly changed, but he didn't respond. Lariette continued, saying she would go eat with her priest friend and that she would forego their walks and dinners, giving him the freedom to focus solely on his work. Asher, still speechless, watched as her lips trembled before she quickly turned away and climbed the stairs to her room, leaving him standing there alone, uncertain of what to say. Once in her room, Lariette lay on her bed and opened her notebook, the one her father had given her. much like the way he had once gifted Rayon a sword encrusted with precious stones. She remembered her brother recounting how his skin had tanned from his journey to the west, sharing joyfully about the refreshing air, the pristine water, and the wonderful people he'd met. Lariette felt a pang of sadness, realizing that she had never been on any trips herself. Despite her desire to do so, she'd always been left out of discussions and decisions. Now, she questioned why she couldn't do what she wanted, even in her final days. The reason she had sought a relationship was to create some happy memories before her time ran out, but it was beginning to feel like a burden to Escher. This confused her, especially since he had never shown hostility towards her. In fact, the way he looked at her during the performance had only made things more complicated. Burying her face in her pillow, Lariette thought about how lonely she felt, trying to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Do-hai was changing into more casual clothes, revealing the scars that covered his body. His subordinate, Joshua, noted that Do-hai had been wearing the robes of a low-level priest too often lately. Joshua found it odd, given Do-hai's exceptional status and immense divine power. He wondered why someone like him would need to disguise himself. But Do-hai brushed off the comment, asking if everyone else wore similar attire. Ignoring the question, Joshua then inquired if Do-ha was planning to meet with that sorceress healer again. As Do-hai tied his hair back into a neat ponytail, holding the hair tie between his teeth, he answered with a simple yes. Joshua grew concerned, reminding him that the girl served Duke Kandel, and if Do-hai's identity as the future pope were discovered, it would bring shame to the church. Amused, Do-ha asked if Joshua truly believed he could be caught so easily, but Joshua remained nervous, suggesting that it might be better to lead Lariette to the Temple of Altion, where she could serve the next pope directly. However, Do-ha shrugged off the suggestion, replying that he was just an ordinary person, before leaving the room. As Joshua watched him go, he couldn't help but think about how interested Do-ha seemed in Lariette. She was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Blanche and the fiancée of Marquis Ezra, whose recent actions had been troubling. Lariette possessed powerful healing abilities and a vast reserve of mana, and it was clear that she was a purification sorceress. She had become close to Duke Kandel, who sought her help to break the curse that plagued him. It was evident the Duke would spare no expense for her services, and Joshua suspected Lariette was in love with Asher, doing her best to capture his attention. Do-ha, now seated in his carriage with a sly grin, contemplated how difficult it would be to make Lariette his personal healer and flirt with her while their relationship remained shallow. He realized he would need to put in more effort to win her over, especially since Lariette clearly liked him as well. But despite this, he couldn't quite figure out how to seduce her. As they approached Asher's estate, the door to Do-ha's carriage suddenly swung open, revealing an anxious Lariette. She asked him if he had any free time today. Surprised, Do-ha replied that he did, wondering why she needed to know. Without hesitation, Lariette climbed into the carriage, asking him to spend the day with her, to go out, eat and shop together. She explained that they were embarking on the jealousy operation, a desperate plan she had come up with in an attempt to gain Asher's attention. Smiling to himself, Do-ha eagerly agreed, as if this was what he had been waiting for. His prey had fallen right into his hands, agreeing to his plan under the guise of a harmless operation. He decided to invite Lariette on a date as part of the café. Do-ha had been growing increasingly frustrated at how long it was taking to be served. As Lariette explained that dessert would take a little more time, she and Do-ha sat on a bench. Lariette, curious, asked if he liked sweets, to which he replied that he did. Seemingly out of nowhere, she questioned why he was allowing her to treat him. Suspecting there might be some catch, Do-ha, looking slightly confused and a bit saddened, explained that he typically avoided getting hurt, but they were supposedly forced to seek treatment outside the temple by the high priest's orders for the lower-ranked workers. Hearing this, Lariette gave him a thumbs up, struggling to hold back tears. She sympathetically told him not to worry, assuring him that if his boss ever bothered him, she would gladly take revenge on his behalf. Amused, Doha found her reaction both endearing and a little funny, considering the vast power he wielded. Still, he played along and agreed, intrigued by how far her interest would go. Lariette, thrilled by his response, eagerly began offering suggestions, like setting the high priest's clothes on fire or hanging them from a tree. She enthusiastically promised to do whatever she could to help. Doha thanked her, trying not to laugh. He knew Lariette was capable of using elemental magic and hoped she wouldn't actually act on these ideas, which could inadvertently turn the temple into an enemy. But he reassured himself that it was all in good humour. As they continued strolling through the streets, looking at shop windows, Larette's attention was suddenly caught by a jewelled brooch displayed among other trinkets. She thought it would suit Asha perfectly. While she was lost in thought, Doha gently placed his hand on her back, startling her. When he asked what had caught her eye, she quickly grew embarrassed and replied that it was nothing. Turning to him with a smile, she added that she was simply admiring the jewellery and thought something would look good on him. Doha, with a smile, encouraged her to go inside and ask about the price, even though he had no use for the decoration himself. Without hesitation, Lariette rushed into the shop. As Doha strolled nearby, he accidentally brushed shoulders with someone. Without a word, he adjusted his clothes and continued walking, but the stranger began shouting, demanding to know why the lower priest hadn't apologized to his elder. The man introduced himself as someone talented, who had become a layman in just 5 years, clearly expecting deference, until he resumed his holdover on the bed. Doha, remaining calm, simply told him not to itch under his ear and to continue on his way. However, the layman was incensed by his tone and grabbed Doha by the collar, yelling that he had no idea who he was dealing with. The layman threatened Doha, boasting of his status and clearly believing himself superior. Doha, growing tired of the situation, considered his options. He thought briefly about using his divine power, enough to burn this man to ashes if he wished, but realized that revealing his true identity wasn't an option, as there were too many onlookers. For now, he decided not to resist, and, with a slight bow, apologized to the elder, even though the situation was reversed. The layman smirked, assuming Doha was finally submitting, but his triumph was short-lived. Within seconds, the layman's clothes mysteriously caught fire. Confused, the man stared at the burning hem of his robe, unsure of what to do, and quickly began screaming. As the flames consumed his clothing, revealing nothing but teddy bear printed underpants, the crowd erupted in laughter. The layman was utterly disgraced in front of everyone. Doha, wide-eyed, realized that the spontaneous combustion wasn't his doing. The entire spectacle left him both astonished and amused. Then he heard a familiar voice, and before he knew it, someone grabbed his hand and pulled him along. With a beaming smile on her face, Lariette tugged him hastily, clearly pleased with herself. Her joyful reaction and the way she quickly fled the scene made it obvious that she had been up to something. Finally, they reached a quiet alley where no one was around, and they disappeared into the bend. Doha immediately asked, "What did you do?" Still catching her breath but grinning, Lariette replied, "I told you, I would take revenge." He stared at her in confusion for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she was being serious, but when she added, "I won't back down if you're in trouble, so don't worry," he couldn't hold back any longer. He burst out laughing, covering his face with his hands. Lariette noticed that Doha was laughing like a true villain, amused by the entire situation. Resting his head on her shoulder, he asked with a mischievous tone, "What am I going to do with you? You're just too interesting." His hand gently wrapped around her neck as he smiled, his voice rising slightly. "It's so fascinating. I want to have you completely." Meanwhile, back at the estate, Asher sat fuming in his room. The butler had just informed him that Lariette had spent the entire day with the priest. Only now did it dawn on him that the priest was a man, not a woman as he had originally thought. The butler, sensing the tension, warned the Duke that if he didn't act soon, things between Lariette and this new friend could escalate beyond mere friendship. Standing in the middle of his room, Asher began to grasp the reality of the situation. He had no idea how far Larette's relationship with Doha had progressed. As he tried to reassure himself that even if they became lovers, it shouldn't matter to him, images of them walking together, kissing sweetly at the end of their outings, tormented him. Sitting on the bed with his face in his hands, the Duke told himself that Lariette was only there to cleanse his curse, nothing more. Their conversations about dates and affection were fleeting, he tried to convince himself. But his head spun, and he couldn't shake the strange feelings churning in his stomach. Looking down at his hands with disappointment in himself, Asher couldn't understand why he felt this way. Who would want a monster like him? Surely Lariette only pitied him, offering sympathy and comfort out of kindness, nothing more. Yet, despite his inner conflict, he decided that there was no point in lingering on these thoughts. Later, as they sat at the dinner table, Lariette suddenly asked why Asher had called for her. He explained that he wanted to talk after such a long time. She responded with mild surprise, noting that she thought the Duke's busy schedule had been sorted out. But in her mind, she wondered whether her plan to make him jealous had worked. As she looked at his stunning face, she had to hold herself back from showering him with compliments, thinking to herself that someone with such beauty could conquer the world. Asher unexpectedly turned to her and asked how she had been, his voice cold and distant. Lariette, panicking slightly and blushing, explained that she had been spending time with her friend. She glanced up at him, hoping he would show some sign of jealousy. But the Duke, looking away, responded indifferently, as if the question had been asked out of mere politeness, and that he didn't really care about her answer. Determined to press on, Lariette mentioned that Doha would be visiting this afternoon and that they would be in her room. She assured the Duke that he shouldn't worry if anything happened, but even then he remained unbothered, replying that it didn't matter to him. Save for one minor issue, he had been presently betrayed by a Secret Service crew arriving at his door. Feeling flustered, Lariette nervously picked up her fork, took a bite, and then, glancing up at him, asked, "Aren't you even a little jealous of me?" After all, that's what she had been aiming for all along. Slowly, Asher turned to face her. Looking at her incredibly sweet face, he suddenly blushed, struggling to maintain his composure. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to say in response to her bold question. But then Asher immediately answered her, saying that he wasn't jealous and that he didn't care, adding that the only thing that mattered to him was that this did not affect the quality of the purification process. In response, Lariette sighed in disappointment, picking at her food with a fork. She had expected a completely different answer. Abruptly, she stood up from the table, surprising the Duke. She explained that she had lost her appetite and said they'd see each other next time during the purification. With that, she left the dining room. Later, Lariette met with Doha, who had updated his image slightly by wearing glasses. He asked her gently what was bothering her. Sitting on the bed, she apologized. The priest, with a sly smile, thought to himself that Asher, cold-blooded as he was, would eventually regret his indifference. For now, though, Doha saw this as an opportunity to grow closer to her. Sitting beside her, he lightly put an arm around her shoulder, gazing at her sympathetically. Lariette, looking up at him, realized that he had come all this way for her, while she was just wallowing in her own problems. Deciding to lighten the mood, she asked about his glasses, teasing that he looked like a librarian, which suited him. Do-ha chuckled, suddenly saying he felt an urgent need to write something, as if overcome by a prophetic urge. This ability, prophecy, was a rare gift, possessed only by the most exceptional believers, and was a crucial factor in choosing a pope. Lariette, surprised by his seriousness, asked if he was all right, but Do-ha shifted the conversation, asking if she really liked his new look. She smiled and called him handsome, adding that everything suited him. Without warning, Do-ha pulled Lariette closer by the waist, their faces only inches apart. He gently held one of her hands while his other arm wrapped around her waist. Gazing directly into her eyes, he asked if they should begin the treatment now. Meanwhile, in his office, Asher was having a heated conversation with his butler. "It's pointless to interfere," he said, clearly referring to Lariette and Dorothy. The butler observed that the young lady had seemed upset after breakfast. If things ended like this, Asher's invitation had been in vain. The butler added that earlier, Asher had even instructed the cooks to remove all the cucumbers from Larette's meal, something the butler found astonishing, as it was the first time the Duke had made such a personal request for a guest. The butler speculated that Asher was experiencing emotional fluctuations. Since he had been cursed, Asher had distanced himself from others, finding it difficult to feel anything. Now, looking at the Duke, the butler sincerely hoped that he would find happiness. He advised Asher to stop hiding his true feelings. Hearing this, Asher was momentarily confused, but the butler turned to leave, suggesting before he exited that the Duke visit Lariette and her guest. "Don't think about anything but your heart," he advised. Asher didn't know how to respond to such advice. He couldn't tell what his heart was saying. He insisted that he shouldn't feel jealousy or anything of the sort. After all, he believed he was incapable of love. When he had been cursed as a child, he had been told that he would forever symbolize torn flesh. The curse had been cast by a witch, and Asher had lived ever since with the belief that his very presence would bring the stench of death. His heart had never been touched since. Yet, despite his doubts, Asher decided to heed the butler's advice and visit Lariette. He walked slowly toward her room, and as he approached, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw Do-ha holding Larette's face. From behind, it looked like they were about to kiss. Asher's eyes widened in shock. Without thinking, he stormed into the room, grabbing Do-ha by the arm and pulling him away from Lariette. Fury flashed in his eyes as he glared at the priest. Lariette was frightened by the sudden intensity, and even Do-ha himself hadn't expected such a harsh reaction. Asher's eyes blazed with fury, and, in a commanding tone, he ordered Do-ha to take his hands off her. Despite the tension, Do-ha wasn't afraid. With a fiery gaze, he greeted the Duke, while Lariette was completely bewildered by the sudden turn of events. The situation had escalated unexpectedly, and the room was charged with tension. Internally, Do-ha was relieved he had chosen to wear glasses today, as it would be problematic if his identity were revealed so soon. Raising his hands in a gesture of peace, Do-ha signaled that he wasn't looking for a confrontation, though Asher's demeanor remained fierce, and even Lariette felt a little intimidated. Trying to calm her down, Do-ha gently called her by her nickname, Larry, which only made her more anxious. She tried to explain that her friend was only treating her and that nothing inappropriate had happened. But when Asher saw Do-ha's arm around her shoulder and the way he called her Larry, it was clear to him that this didn't look like just a friendly relationship. Asher glared at Do-ha, who looked back at him slyly, stroking Larette's head in a way that only infuriated the Duke further. Unable to tolerate it any longer, Asher sternly told the priest that he was free to leave. Do-ha, without protest, got out of bed and walked out of the room. As he left, he adjusted his glasses with a grin, amused by the unfolding drama. He thought to himself that the story was becoming more intriguing by the day, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. Asher sat down next to Lariette on the bed, both of them silent and unsure of what to say. Finally, Lariette broke the silence, reminding the Duke that he had claimed not to be jealous of her. Her face flushed slightly as she spoke, clearly nervous. Asher, his head lowered, remained quiet, his mind racing. He couldn't deny to himself that he had been too emotional. Was he really jealous of her? He often found himself thinking that her kindness could be given to someone else, and the thought made his blood boil. Now, as he looked at her, he realized he didn't want her to hate him. He didn't want to hurt her. After wrestling with his thoughts and emotions, Asher suddenly came to a realization. He wanted Lariette to be his. He had been turning away from his true feelings for too long. Lariette, noticing his silence, nervously asked if she could still meet with Doha, strangely seeking his permission. Asher turned to her, silent for a few seconds, as if deep in thought, before finally asking her not to do it. His face flushed as he continued, asking Lariette not to leave. It was as though he had held that request on the tip of his tongue for so long, and now it had finally slipped out. He admitted that he had never imagined his heart could beat so fast. With his head lowered, Asher explained that even when he didn't want to, his thoughts always drifted back to her. He confessed that just imagining her with another man made him want to cut off the hand that had touched her. Larette's mouth dropped open in shock as she listened to his unexpected confessions. She had never thought she would hear such words from him. Then Asher, lifting his gaze to meet hers, admitted that if this was what jealousy felt like, then yes, he was insanely jealous. As he reached out a hand to touch her face, he stopped midway, fearing he might hurt her. He continued, saying that he felt lost, unsure of where these strange emotions were taking him, but despite his confusion, he finally asked Lariette if her offer for a romantic relationship was still valid. He confessed that he liked her. Lariette, wide-eyed and trying to process everything she had just heard, suddenly smiled. A blush spread across her cheeks as she joyfully gave him her answer. Yes, she wanted to be with him. She threw herself into his arms, surprising him. Asher, embarrassed, blushed deeply as he awkwardly hugged her back, his heart racing wildly. Moving slightly away from him, Lariette smiled and declared that she looked forward to their relationship with great excitement. Asher, still stunned by everything, quietly echoed that he was looking forward to it as well. He couldn't believe what was happening, that this was real. For him, this was a first, a new experience of love, something he had never imagined for himself. As they sat together, each was lost in their own thoughts. Lariette dreamed of spending the next 3 months with excitement and joy, while Asher was already making grand plans for their future. He imagined renovating the garden, picturing Lariette living in the house with him for the rest of their lives. After some time, Lariette decided to present Asher with a list of plans that they could carry out together. She eagerly awaited his opinion and perhaps a few suggestions of his own. Curious, Asher asked what the list was for, and Lariette explained that these were activities they would do together. But as he skimmed through the list, Asher's heart sank. There were so many things he felt he couldn't do because of his weakened body. He flipped through the notebook, hoping to find something else, but Lariette abruptly stopped him. "There's nothing important beyond that," she said nervously, her heart racing. She didn't want him to see the next pages, where she had listed her private wishes. More importantly, she didn't want him to discover that she was terminally ill, especially now that they had just begun their relationship. When Asher saw a crossed-out item on the list, city tour, he tensed immediately, knowing who she had spent that day with. Though he didn't say anything, the thought gnawed at him. Sensing his discomfort, Lariette quickly explained that it was merely a wish list, not something she specifically wanted to do with her boyfriend. Seeing his tense expression, Asher, trying to mask his feelings, suggested that she didn't have to fulfill all the points with him. But instead of feeling relieved, Lariette burst into laughter. "You're so cute when you're jealous," she teased, and Asher was stunned. No one had ever called him cute before. Blushing slightly, she leaned closer, looked him straight in the eyes, and softly said that she wanted to complete every item on the list with him. Only him. She then asked, in a sweet voice, if he liked her plan. Before Asher could respond, Lariette hugged him, her excitement bubbling over like a child's. She told him how much she loved the idea of doing all these things together. Soon after, they found themselves in one of the Empire's finest boutiques. Lariette was thrilled to be in the city with Asher, and as they browsed through the beautiful clothes, she tried on a stunning dress. She looked like a living doll in it. Stepping out to show him, she asked, "What do you think?" Asher was speechless, his mouth slightly open in surprise. The shop attendants helped her select more dresses, but Lariette was curious about Asher's opinion. Yet he remained silent. After a while, Asher quietly said that she didn't need to choose any of the dresses because he was prepared to buy her everything she liked. He even offered to buy her all the jewelry she had admired, and he kept his word, purchasing every item she had tried on. When they were riding home, the carriage was overflowing with boxes of clothing and jewelry. As they rode, Lariette suddenly asked why he hadn't responded earlier. Confused, Asher asked what she meant. She poked him lightly in the stomach and reminded him of her question about the dress, why he hadn't said anything back at the boutique. She poked him again playfully, and Asher, turning away in embarrassment, quietly admitted that he had been too flustered to respond. He thought Lariette had looked so beautiful in the dress that he had been rendered speechless. Lariette, feigning indignation, teased him for taking too long to compliment her. She continued poking him in the side, insisting that if he thought she was beautiful, he should say so immediately. The gentle touches flustered Asher, and he quickly grabbed her hand, trying to stop her. Holding her hand, he looked straight into her eyes, and gathering his courage, he finally told her, "You are truly very beautiful." Asher was so close to her now, the distance between their faces barely noticeable. Lariette, narrowing her eyes and blushing, asked if he honestly thought she was beautiful. Then, with a bold smile, she suddenly asked him to kiss her. The request embarrassed Asher deeply, but Lariette, resting her hand on his shoulder, was ready for the kiss. Asher, on the other hand, was not. Their faces inched closer, and just when they were about to kiss, the coachman's voice suddenly interrupted them. He announced that they had arrived, asking where to move the luggage. Startled, the couple froze, staring wide-eyed at each other. Embarrassed beyond words, Asher bolted from the carriage the moment the door opened, leaving Lariette behind, surprised and confused by his sudden departure. A few days later, Lariette, dressed beautifully for dinner, sat down at the table, feeling a bit sad. Since their interrupted kiss, there had been no progress in their relationship. Asher, always the gentleman, still treated her with care, straightening her napkin as she sat. But Lariette couldn't help but feel that their relationship hadn't changed much since before they were together. Time was slipping away, and she knew she didn't have much left. As Asher took his seat, Lariette, with an innocent smile, playfully asked him to feed her, making the first move that he seemed too shy to take himself. After this, Lariette added softly that she wanted to receive love from her lover today. Asher, the Duke, was puzzled. She seemed perfectly capable of eating on her own, so why did she need this? Still, he didn't want to refuse her. Picking up a piece of salad with his fork, Asher carefully and slowly brought it to her lips. Lariette leaned forward and quickly ate the small bite, smiling warmly at him. Suddenly she rushed to hug him, saying how kind he was and that he was the best man. Asher was incredibly embarrassed by her affection. When Lariette hugged him even tighter, his face turned as red as a ripe tomato, and he felt like he was burning with shame. Flustered, he quickly stood up from the table, mumbling about how much work he still had to do. Without waiting for her to respond, he hurriedly left, even as she tried to stop him for just a few more minutes. Asher simply waved a quick goodbye as he fled, leaving both Lariette and the butler bewildered by his sudden departure. It was then that Lariette realized something. Perhaps the Duke only wanted a platonic relationship. This thought struck her as a disaster, and she slumped forward, lightly hitting her head on the table in frustration. She wasn't entirely certain yet, but it weighed heavily on her mind. A few days later, Lariette visited Asher's bedroom. She opened the door slightly, announcing that she had come to perform a cleansing. As she walked in, she resolved that even if she didn't have much time left, and even if Asher didn't like her touch, she would accept it. After all, what kind of love was it if it caused discomfort and suffering? Smiling sweetly, she told him they would work on his upper body today. Asher, though embarrassed, began to unbutton his shirt slowly, preparing himself. Lariette watched, thinking about how handsome he looked as he undressed. Once his chest was bare, he sat quietly on the sofa, nervously saying he was ready. The Duke was still uncomfortable with the situation, especially with his girlfriend so close and about to touch his bare skin. Lariette approached him, gently starting the cleansing process. Asher tried to distract himself, thinking of anything else, but then Lariette stopped suddenly and leaned her elbows on his chest. Concerned, Asher asked if she was all right. She quietly reassured him, saying she was feeling better than before, but was still a bit dizzy. Blushing slightly, Lariette asked if she could hug him. Asher, looking into her eyes, blushed deeply and explained that it was hard for him to restrain himself. It wasn't entirely clear what he meant, but he turned away, gently holding her by the shoulders and suggesting they keep some distance. He admitted that he could be somewhat impatient. Lariette, excited, grabbed his hand and looked into his eyes, telling him he didn't need to hold back. He could do as he wished. Something seemed to snap in Asher at that moment. In one swift motion, he threw Lariette onto the sofa and hovered over her. Both of them were suddenly embarrassed by the intensity of the moment. Asher asked again if he truly had her permission, wanting to be sure that she wouldn't mind if he did what he desired. Lariette, thinking she had only wanted a simple kiss, realized the situation had quickly escalated. She felt as though Asher might devour her. His powerful body, heavy breathing, and intense gaze all hinted at his overwhelming desire. He gently took her hand and began covering it with soft kisses. Overcome with embarrassment, Lariette called out his name, stopping him halfway. She pulled her hand back, pressed it to her face, and quietly apologized, looking into his sea-blue eyes. Asher, trying to collect his thoughts, realized he needed to stop before things went too far. Gently helping her up, he asked her not to put them in such a situation again, explaining that next time he wouldn't be able to let her go so easily. Lariette promised she wouldn't act so thoughtlessly again. The Duke apologized for frightening her as he began to get dressed. He realized he, too, needed to be more careful, because he didn't know what might happen if they found themselves in a similar situation again. A few days later, Lariette, once again emboldened, practically sat on top of Asher, playfully suggesting they finish what they had started. Without much shame, she leaned in and gave him a long-awaited, sweet kiss on the lips. How the rest of the story unfolded remains to be seen. One morning, a few days after the cleansing, Lariette expressed her desire for Asher to take her on a date to a restaurant. She showed him a list of ideas, but Asher declined, explaining that even something as simple as going to a restaurant would be difficult for him due to his curse. The eyes of others always saw him as a monster, and they were wary of him. With sadness in his voice, Asher apologized to Lariette, regretting that she, as the beloved of a cursed man, would have to give up so much. Looking at her bright, unwavering smile, Asher felt guilty for not being able to give her what she deserved, but Lariette, gathering her strength, smiled even more radiantly and reassured him that the location of their date didn't matter to her. The only thing that was important was that they spend time together. After hearing this, Asher smiled joyfully as they continued their conversation. However, in the midst of their discussion, the Duke completely forgot about his responsibilities. Lariette, noticing this, decided to remind him by gently pushing him toward the door, telling him he would be late for his duties at the palace. Asher agreed, adding that he would return to her very soon. He thought to himself that he would finish his work quickly, then come home to have dinner with her. They could enjoy a relaxing evening, talking over a drink and discussing interesting topics. He planned to ask her about her day, how she had adjusted to her new surroundings, and what kind of alcohol and snacks she preferred. But the meeting turned out to be far longer and more tedious than expected. After an hour of pointless discussion, Asher, frustrated, decided to speak up. He asked the men present how long they intended to keep up this useless argument. Upon hearing this, the room immediately fell silent. Even the emperor was taken aback. However, one man grew indignant at the Duke's blunt behavior, especially in front of His Majesty. Angrily, he slammed his fists on the table. Asher, crossing his arms, understood that the father of his beloved Lariette was the one speaking. He wasn't sure whether to ignore the outburst or take action, but it was clear from the man's reaction that only a single glance from the Duke was enough to put him in his place. The Emperor, considering the situation, decided it was time to bring the discussion to an end. With the word "end" spoken, Asher immediately rose from his seat and rushed home. Larette's father was furious at what he considered an impudent departure, seeing it as an affront to his authority. One of the gentlemen next to him remarked that Asher was incredibly fortunate, for he knew just how fierce the Duke could be. He was puzzled as to why this man was so eager to challenge him, and, with a sly grin, he advised the irate father that, if he wanted to save his family from decline, he needed to be much wiser. Larette's father, beside himself with anger and shame, stormed out of the hall. He walked down the corridor, clenching his fists in frustration. In his mind, he blamed everything on his daughter. If only someone had managed the household better, perhaps their finances wouldn't be in such a mess. Furthermore, with his son-in-law, Rayon, spending recklessly, the family situation was worsening. His wife blamed him for Larette's decision to run away, claiming it was because she hadn't received proper education. However, as long as Rayon worked for the Imperial family, they still had money. Still, the situation was only deteriorating day by day. Lariette was the only one who had dared to confront him, and he thought that if she returned and apologized for her actions, everything would be fixed. He believed that if she cried and repented, he would show mercy and welcome her back into the family. As he walked further, he asked himself where else Lariette could find a father as wonderful as him, mentally urging her to return before it was too late. Later that evening, Lariette, clearly out of breath, hurried into one of the rooms to ask the butler where Asher was, since he was no longer in the hall. The butler, smiling sweetly, explained that the Duke had gone to change clothes, but was concerned about leaving Lariette waiting. Hearing this, Lariette calmly exhaled. Just then, Asher appeared behind her, having arrived quietly. He asked, teasing her if she was running, noticing how short of breath she was. Lariette, startled, turned around and asked when he had arrived. Asher, stroking her hair and smiling, reassured her that there was no need to meet him in such a hurry, though it was clear how much he appreciated her eagerness. As they moved to the sofa, Lariette, still embarrassed, reflected on the Duke's experience with relationships. She couldn't help but wonder if, with such a body and face, this could truly be his first love. Asha, looking at her thoughtful expression, couldn't understand what she was thinking, especially since her face seemed to change with every passing moment. They were suddenly distracted by the butler, who, using magic, began to perform extraordinary tricks. Fruits floated in the air, and bottles juggled themselves. Both Asha and Lariette were amazed by the spectacle. The Duke, particularly surprised, hadn't known his butler could do such things. The butler, bowing his head proudly, explained that as a butler, he was trained to do everything. After hearing this, Asha immediately left the room, wishing the couple a pleasant night. After a while, Lariette and Asha clinked their glasses joyfully, toasting to each other's health. Asha thought to himself that it was enough for him that they were together. Lariette, however, poured more alcohol for herself, drinking quickly. Asha watched with concern and asked if she was drinking too fast, but she reassured him that she was fine and asked him not to worry. While she continued drinking, Lariette reflected on how alcohol had been her only solace before leaving home. Asha, noticing her mood, asked her how the drink tasted. She immediately shared her opinion and then told him that before his arrival she had walked through the garden. She mentioned that the fountain where they had once fallen into had no water, which had disappointed her. Asha listened intently, his face lighting up with love, as if every word she said was the most interesting thing in the world. He gazed at her with affection, and she, in turn, looked at him with the same warmth. Then Lariette suddenly brought up Dohai, explaining that he was just a friend and had helped her a lot with her relationships. Feeling a bit embarrassed, she asked Asha if it would be all right for her to continue her treatment with the priest, as he was the best healer she knew. She added that it wouldn't matter if Asha was against it. Asha, unsure about the nature of the treatment, couldn't understand what kind of treatment she was receiving. He sensed that she might be hiding something, but decided it wasn't his place to ask, especially if it was for her health. He didn't want her to hate him, so he advised her to do whatever she felt was best for herself. Lariette smiled sweetly in response, and then, without warning, laid her head on his shoulder. She straightened her dress, feeling unusually warm, and began to unbutton it. The alcohol in her blood made the task difficult, so she suddenly grabbed Asha's hand. He was extremely confused and didn't know how to react. She placed his palm on her chest, which only confused him more, leaving him speechless. Lariette, gazing up at him, asked him to help take off her dress, holding his hand in place. Lariette swore. As the situation grew more intense, Asha pulled his hand away and asked if she was drunk. He was genuinely worried because she was acting strangely. But before he could process everything, Lariette pushed him onto the sofa and sat on top of him. She looked at him, smiling, and asked if he wanted to continue where they had left off last time. Asha's heart raced, and he tried to maintain control, reminding himself to be patient and resist his own desires. He thought she was just drunk, and that's why she was behaving this way. But as he thought about it, he realized just how drunk she really was, and his concern deepened. He covered himself with his hand, trying to stay calm. He asked Lariette to get off him, explaining that he knew this wouldn't end well. She smiled and giggled, replying that she would only get off if he fulfilled her wish. It was clear that her behavior didn't embarrass her or cause discomfort because of her intoxication. Asha, turning away, said he would do whatever she wanted. He tried to force himself to think of something else, to clear his mind of any bad thoughts. Lariette, smiling joyfully, asked him to kiss her. The request made Asha feel even more awkward, but he understood that she only wanted a kiss, and nothing more. So he gently placed his hand on her cheek and, leaning in, asked her to keep her promise. The distance between them grew smaller, and she closed her eyes, anticipating the kiss. However, Asher did things differently. He placed a neat, gentle kiss on her cheek. Even this simple kiss embarrassed him greatly. But Lariette wasn't satisfied with just that. She immediately took the initiative, placing her hand on his face and leaning in to kiss him. Asher tried to stop her, but she managed to steal a kiss from him. Lariette, feeling victorious, broke away, smiling like a mischievous cat. She thought to herself that this was the real kiss she had been waiting for. Asher, wide-eyed and stunned, couldn't believe what had just happened. The kiss had lasted much longer than he had expected, and he found himself struggling to process the situation. Angrily, he asked her to know when to stop, but before he could react further, he swiftly threw her onto the sofa, hovering over her. Holding her wrist with one hand, he looked into her eyes and insisted that they needed to take things in moderation. Lariette, still trying to process his words, felt her eyelids growing heavy and her vision blurred. A few seconds later, Lariette opened her mouth wide and fell into a deep sleep. The alcohol had clearly affected her, something Asher hadn't anticipated. He sat next to her on the sofa, feeling strange. He couldn't believe that the girl who had just stolen his first kiss was now lying beside him, asleep with her mouth open. The next morning, Lariette happily barged into Asher's office, shouting a cheerful greeting. Asher, looking slightly tired, noticed that she had finally woken up. But, judging by her carefree and joyful expression, it was clear that she remembered little of what had happened the previous night. Scratching the back of her head, Lariette began questioning him. She only remembered asking permission from Doha about the treatment, but after that, everything was a blur. Asher was shocked. Lariette seemed embarrassed by her body's reaction to the alcohol and quickly tried to explain herself. She usually tolerated alcohol well, but apparently it didn't mix well with cocktails. Asher was only now realizing that she had stolen his first kiss, and she didn't even remember it. His expression turned stern as he suddenly told her that from now on she was strictly prohibited from drinking alcohol with anyone else. Lariette was taken aback and indignantly asked why, explaining that others had told her she drank well. The mention of others made Asher's mood darken. He wondered who exactly she was referring to, replaying her words in his head. A hint of jealousy crept in as he thought about it. Meanwhile, Lariette hesitated, thinking that it wouldn't be fair to tell him the truth, given how many women he must have had in his life. How many addresses he must have loved. At that moment, the butler appeared at the door, smiling as he informed them that a priest had arrived to see Lariette. When Lariette turned towards him, she noticed the sudden change in Asher's expression. He ordered the guest to be escorted to the living room. When Lariette entered the room, she found Dohe sitting on the sofa, still wearing his glasses, seemingly for secrecy. He crossed his legs with an air of authority and smiled sweetly when he saw her. He mentioned that they hadn't seen each other for a while. Lariette, a little embarrassed, apologized for how she had hastily escorted him out the last time they met. Doha reassured her that it was nothing, and as she sat next to him, he gently stroked her head. He added that he had no regrets, and if she truly felt sorry, she could visit him next time. He subtly hinted that it was a relief to avoid unnecessary things, as they were now surrounded by servants who were watching their every move. Doha clearly understood that Asher had arranged this situation on purpose. Turning to him, Lariette asked if they could change her treatment. Doha immediately inquired if Asher had forced her to make the change. Lariette clarified that she was doing it because it was something she personally cared about, her relationship with Asher and her contact with other men. Doha understood, but the thought of her being involved with Asher clearly made him uneasy. Smiling at her, he gave his consent but warned that the treatment's effectiveness might be slightly reduced. Lariette thanked him, and he carefully took her hand, pretending to be upset. The priest, with a hint of sadness, then asked if their friendship would end because of this change. Lariette, who didn't want to upset him, immediately assured him that this wasn't the case. She apologized for possibly disappointing him, but she had no intention of ending their friendship. Doha, sensing the tension, asked if Lariette would like to go to the library with him. Confused, she asked if he meant to visit today. Doha confirmed it, explaining that the library was still open. Since Asha seemed to be busy, Lariette agreed, assuming they would go as friends. However, just as they were about to leave, Asha's voice suddenly rang out behind them. He stepped into the doorway, looking tense. Noticing the way Doha was eyeing him, Asha asked if there was a problem with him accompanying them to the library. Doha was clearly displeased and hadn't expected Asha to show such interest in a place he usually avoided. It was evident that jealousy was at play. Doha stood and bowed to Asha, introducing himself as a priest of lower rank. Asha, however, didn't acknowledge him. Lariette looked at him with a dissatisfied expression and then asked if he had said he would be very busy that day. Asha, looking down at her, replied that what mattered now was spending time with his girlfriend. Lariette blushed, clearly not expecting such a sweet response. She lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Asha returned to the matter at hand, asking if he could join them at the library. The atmosphere between him and Doha was tense, as both exchanged stern looks. But then, with a forced smile, Doha replied that of course Asha could join them. It would be an honor. Asha, satisfied with the response, asked the butler to prepare a carriage for them.